Tonight, world leaders prepare to gather in Rome as Pope Francis's funeral is set for Saturday. The Prime Minister and Donald Trump are among those set to travel as the Vatican releases pictures of the Pope lying in state in the apartments where he died. Well, these are live pictures from St. Peter's Square, where this evening people have been invited to pray for the late Pope. Also tonight, growth forecasts for the UK are cut by a third, but with Donald Trump's trade war only partly to blame, the Chancellor faces questions about her handling of the economy. I'll speak to the former Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab about trade, tariffs and Trump. The Prime Minister says he believes a woman is an adult female as the Supreme Court's ruling on gender causes divisions inside the government. And at La Vista Hilton, David Cameron's former advisor announces a bid to follow in Schwarzenegger's footsteps to become Governor of California. We'll ask if the similarities end there. All that and more with Baroness Saeeda Vasi and Phil Commons. They will be back later on in the show. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. The funeral of Pope Francis will be held on Saturday in the square outside St. Peter's Basilica. And we're also learning more details about who will be attending, including Donald Trump, Keir Starmer and Prince William. Now, the organisational and ceremonial details are, of course, important, and it is right for us to think of those. But they shouldn't stop us pausing and reflecting on something deeper about what happened on Easter Monday, a time of death and rebirth for Christians and Catholics. The death of Pope Francis, the man, is a personal tragedy for those who knew him and followed him. It's also a moment of immense religious significance for the world's 1.4 billion Catholics. And it is also a moment of political significance too, and that matters, frankly, to all of us. Pope Francis was seen as a reformer, and he used his power to speak to those and for those without power.
We, the people of this continent, are not fearful of foreigners, because most of us were once foreigners.
During the Israel-Hamas war, Pope Francis called the only Catholic church in Gaza every day. Every day.
More than 1 year and a half, and he called every day. He asked to us to help the people, to protect the children.
So Pope Francis changed the language and the tone of the Catholic Church. He was a member of the establishment who tried to shake off its robes, literally as well. He wandered out without traditional vestments, wearing a simple white cassock. He preferred a Ford Focus to the papal limo. But here's the thing, because Pope Francis was a reformer in terms of language, style, tone, but not really theology, not doctrine. Now, he said this about homosexuality in 2013.
If a person is gay and seeks God and has goodwill, who am I to judge them?
And I don't want to downplay the importance of language and tone because it matters, because, a Pope saying things like that does matter. But frankly, the theological fights are still to come. How far to accept gay relationships or female priests? Should the Catholic faith modernise or lean into tradition? The most difficult questions still linger, and the next Pope may not have the luxury of leaving them unanswered. Now, these are live pictures from St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, where people have been invited to offer their prayers following the Pope's death. And of course, many, many more people are expected to gather there in the run-up to the funeral that will be held on Saturday. Our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons has our first report.
For the first time in more than a decade, the Vatican awoke with no pope to look to for guidance. Here's an absence felt by more than 1 billion Catholics. By the morning, nearly half the world's cardinals had arrived. These are the people who will decide the name of the next pope. But their first task was to schedule Francis's funeral, and they chose Saturday morning. The crowds here growing fast. They mourn, but many also celebrate a life that inspired them. Sister Mary moved to Rome from Kenya 10 years ago. How will you remember him?
I will remember him especially for his smile, his love, his humanity, and a man who gave us hope, even when we thought that everything is lost. I will remember him that way.
We now know the Pope woke as normal on Monday at 6 a.m, but suffered a stroke about an hour later. A police escort was requested to get him to hospital, and it was then cancelled when it became clear that Francis could not recover. The Pope lies in state within the Vatican. His funeral service will be held here, but then he will be taken across Rome to the Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore, where he will be buried. There we met Marcela and Pablo, here from Buenos Aires, and deeply proud of their Argentinian compatriot.
He worked a lot with young people, with the humble and the poor.
We already knew what he was like when he was Bishop of Buenos Aires. He would travel on the metro. He didn't have a driver. He did mass in the poor areas, and he worked a lot on the issue of immigration. It was something that really concerned him.
Back at the Vatican, the sun beats down and the square ever more packed. Pope Francis's decision not to be buried here at St. Peter's, but instead across town at Santa Maria Maggiore, is a break with tradition. It's not unprecedented, but it's certainly unusual. And it means that the task of organising this event, already dauntingly complex, has now become even more complicated. Prince William will represent the King. Keir Starmer will also attend. Presidents and prime ministers from America, France, Germany, and of course Italy and Argentina are all coming to Rome, and many more leaders will follow. The security operation is huge. Cars banned, a no-fly zone, and police boats on the Tiber. It is a big challenge for Matteo Scamma, the person in charge of protecting everyone and everything involved in this funeral.
This is certainly something new for us, but we'll be ready for this occasion. We'll have enough personnel to ensure safety both at the Vatican and during the transfer, which is also important, and then of course at the event itself, for the burial.
Pope Francis's body will be moved into St. Peter's Basilica tomorrow, when the public will be able to file past, and the crowds here will simply grow and grow. Adam Parsons, Sky News, Vatican City.
Well, meanwhile, here in the UK, a special mass for Pope Francis is being held at Liverpool Cathedral. Our chief North of England correspondent, Greg Milam, joins us now from Liverpool. Greg, what are we expecting?
Yeah, this is a requiem mass, a sung mass, a special mass in honour of Pope Francis. And according to the Archbishop of Liverpool, who will hold the homily during this mass, it is for Catholics here, but also other Christians, non-Catholics and those of no faith, to come along and maybe pray for Pope Francis, but also to reflect on his life. Liverpool, of course, is a city with a long Catholic heritage, a large Catholic population. We saw, before the service began this evening, the longest line I've seen over the last day or two of people to sign that book of condolence, and many of the messages in there are messages reflecting on the fact that Pope Francis worked so much for the poor and the downtrodden, as people wrote, and that's why their respect, I think, for non-Catholics as well is so greater. The Archbishop of Liverpool talking about people feeling bereft. They've lost a Holy Father, but to many people it feels like losing a father, and that's why it is such a moment for them, this feeling of connection he talked about. Even if people didn't go to Rome, never were in the presence of the Pope, they felt that connection. They felt that he was encouraging them in their lives. And the Archbishop has talked a lot about those meetings he had with the Pope over the course of his papacy of 12 years. As I say, he will read the homily. There are local political figures, clergy from across the Archdiocese. This moment really for the city of Liverpool and beyond to mark the Pope's life.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. Grab Milan there. Let's bring in our duo for the evening, shall we? The former co-chair of the Conservative Party, now non-affiliated peer Baroness Farsi, and the former speechwriter for Tony Blair and associate editor of Prospect, Philip Collins. Great to have you both here. So you just dropped in to us that you were there at the Pope's inauguration.
I was in 2013. I had the privilege of representing government. Myself and Ken Clarke were the two cabinet ministers who attended on behalf of the government in 2013, where hundreds of dignitaries from around the world and thousands of ordinary members of the public were there. And as the news came in on Monday morning, Sophie, I was really sad. I mean, I don't think people realise the power of the leadership that Pope Francis actually displayed. And if you think about just what's happening in the world right now, and this simple fact that I was aware of, which was that almost on a daily basis, one of the things that he did in the evening around 7 p.m. was to ring the Christian community in Gaza. And the hope that he gave them through these traumatic times, and the way that he spoke so boldly about what was happening there, and how so many people, not even Christians, Muslims, Jews, others, who saw him as somebody who was prepared to speak truth to power in these very difficult times. His commitment to the poor, to refugees, not being scared and didn't shy away from the difficult discussions. And then his fantastic sense of humour, which always came through right from those very early days when he first became Pope. So for me, a real honour and privilege that I was there at the time of his inauguration, that I had the opportunity to meet him, and real sadness, because I think we've lost not just an important religious leader, but an important, compassionate leader in these difficult times.
Yeah, this is it. It's the religious leadership, but it's the political leadership, and it's something alongside that religious leadership as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think within the church, he was definitely seen as a liberal. Now, of course, to be a liberal within the confines of the doctrine of the Catholic Church is not quite the same as being sort of member of the Liberal Democrats, but within that community, he was definitely a liberal for the reasons that Soda gives, which is to say that he spoke very well and compassionately on migration, on refugees. He had liberal positions on homosexuality and on the position of women, liberal within the church. And so the interesting question is where the church goes next. Because, of course, we now will enter the conclave, the proceedings that will produce a new pope, the ballots by which they gradually eliminate things until the white smoke emerges. And the question will be, what is the doctrinal bias of the next pope?
Yeah.
Very interesting question, because 135 cardinals have the vote, of whom 108 were appointed by Pope Francis. Now, I don't know whether he stuffed the place with his nominees in the way of a Supreme Court judge manoeuvre. I don't know if he did that at all, but it may be that there's a bias more towards Latin America and away from Europe, and more towards the liberal side of the denomination than the illiberal. But
it's going to be so interesting. And it's always the most unpredictable as well, right? It's very hard to know which way the cardinals are going to go. Really interesting to get your thoughts on this. We'll have lots more from both of you throughout the programme. Now, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is heading to Washington today as finance ministers gather to digest the IMF's latest forecast for the global economy. It predicts a global slowdown caused in part by Donald Trump's trade war, which will also hit growth here in the UK. Now, the IMF's chief economist spoke about the global impact of the tariffs.
The landscape has changed since our last World Economic Outlook update in January. We're entering a new era as the global economic system that has operated for the last 80 years is being reset. Since late January, many tariff announcements have been made, culminating on April 2nd with near-universal levies from the United States and counter-responses from some trading partners. The US effective tariff rate has surged past levels reached more than 100 years ago, while tariff rates on the US have also increased.
Let's speak now to our business and economics correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, who's in Washington for us. Gurpreet, I know exactly what the government will do here. They'll say, look, this is a global picture, this is international factors beyond our control. Is that the whole story?
It's not the whole story. On one level, the forecasts from the IMF, the message from the IMF was pretty straightforward, that Trump's tariff war is going to weigh heavily on the global economy. Forecasts were slashed across the board, not just for the obvious victims like the US and China or Mexico and Canada, but as you mentioned, also for the UK. The fund said that the UK economy would grow by just 1.1% this year. That means its forecasts for the UK have been cut by a third. However, it's worth pointing out that it's not just the tariff war that's going to affect us. The fund said that we had domestic challenges, like rising utility bills, for example, which are going to cause inflation to go higher, which will weigh on consumer spending, as well as rising government borrowing costs, which will weigh on economic growth. I actually asked the fund of those two challenges, the global challenges and the domestic challenges, which are causing the most damage. And they said it's the homegrown challenges that are the bigger problem for Rachel Reeves. So it's worth bearing that in mind as the Chancellor prepares to meet her US counterpart, Scott Bessent, in Washington later in the week. Although a deal would be welcome, especially by our exporters, it's not going to solve our problems. Nevertheless, the meeting with Mr. Bessent will be pivotal, and in many ways, it will be symbolic. She has the challenge of trying to make the case for open and free trade to a US administration that's already turned against it. And it's that context that's giving an added edge to the IMF meetings this year. You heard in that clip just ahead of me that the IMF's chief economist was pretty clear and stark on that matter. He said that the global economy was entering a new era, that the global system that's existed for the last 80 years was being reset. And it's institutions like the IMF and its sister organisation, the World Bank, that have been pillars of that system of global cooperation. So it was also feeling, Sophie, a little bit existential.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you very much, Gurpreet Narwan, speaking to us there. Well, the policies of the US president have always influenced the global economy, but perhaps with Donald Trump, we're at a whole new level of impact. Earlier, I spoke to the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. He's now head of global affairs for the private equity firm Appian Capital Advisory. Thank you very much for being on the programme.
Pleasure.
I'm not going to lie, when former ministers come on keen to talk about, their new industry, it can be a bit of a stretch to make it relevant, but actually you're working in an area that feels right at the centre of global politics. Can you just explain in a sentence what critical minerals actually are, first of all?
Well, look, in the modern digital economy, critical minerals and rare earths do everything from provide the materials for your phone, particularly smartphones, right the way through to electric vehicles. And also on the national security side, perhaps the things that people would be less familiar with, from drone technology to nuclear submarines to F-16 fighter pilots, they're providing the raw materials that keep us safe.
So it's all about security as well. And we've been familiar, I guess, with critical minerals, partly because of the minerals agreement that may or may not be signed over Ukraine. There has been suggestions from both Trump and Zelensky that it could be happening. Do you think it's an agreement that is in Ukraine's interest to sign?
Look, for all the froth and the media debate around it, actually, if a deal could be done that could help bring about a ceasefire, that could help with the reconstruction of Ukraine, and at the same time vest America's interests in a stable peace and provide the supply chains that the US and other Western allies need, seems like a pretty smart win-win deal, but the devil will always be in the detail.
Yeah, and we don't have much of the detail now, of course. Donald Trump seems to have suggested that it would, I guess, act as a security guarantee because Russia wouldn't strike in areas where you've got Americans working. I mean, do you think that's valid? Do you think it's right?
Well, look, put it this way. There's graphite, there's lithium, there's rare earths in Ukraine. I think there's still a lot of due diligence to be done, technical analysis, before investors are going to provide the kind of capital that will be required to make that profitable. But what they would be looking for is the kind of stability in the jurisdiction that could only come with US security guarantees. So for all that's been debated, it seems like a pretty strong commitment by the US administration, if you like, long-term enlightened self-interest in the future of Ukraine. I think if I was President Zelensky, and I think this is why he's leaning towards that deal, I would see the benefits from Ukraine. Not just reconstruction and development, but rising Ukraine up the value chain, because they would presumably want to try and do not just the extraction, but some of the refining and processing. So I can definitely see the contours of a win-win deal in that.
I mean, some people might look at this and you might disagree, this might be like from a position of ignorance, and think, look, this is about Trump just squeezing Ukraine. What's going on? This is a country that's been crippled by war. It's a bit much for America to come in and say, oh, give us all your minerals as well.
Well, look at the US as it articulated, not just by President Trump, but by President Biden, his approach to Afghanistan and other areas of conflict, want to make sure that they rebalance. They don't want to be involved in what they call forever wars. And I think the US is saying, and there's a lot of popular support for it, that we need a stake in our international commitments. And given how much money has been spent in supporting Ukraine and other allies in other areas around the world, I don't think that looking for a win-win deal is wrong. Actually, again, we come back to this concept of enlightened self-interest. Actually, that may be the most enduring type and a smart way to have the US vested in the long-term stability of that country.
The other country that Donald Trump's been talking about quite a lot is Greenland.
Yes.
He's floated the idea of the US actually taking over Greenland. Is that all about critical minerals as well?
Graphite, copper, zirconium, which is used in nuclear reactors. Look, Greenland's got a lot of that. Putting the diplomatic niceties to one side...
Just one way of saying, oh, I'm going to take over your country.
Well, again, if you look at the critical minerals and rare earth space, there is a massive monopoly. The elephant in the room is China's monopoly in large areas of this. And we've seen, of course, recently export restrictions on those minerals being traded outside of China. China has also gone around, look at DRC, another issue, Congo, that's been in the news, the copper and the cobalt mines. It's also bought up a lot of the mines and the capacity to do the refining and the processing. So what I think we're seeing from the US is a focus on a massive long-term strategic issue and quite a lot of detail coming out in the executive orders. The appointment of Marco Rubio has been red hot on this as a senator of Florida. And actually, again, some of the media froth and the polarisation aside, we haven't seen the US president focus on such a long-term strategic issue. I think that's welcome. There's a huge amount, though, to do, and there's some unanswered questions. Capital investment, how do you support capital investment, unlock the private sector investment in getting the critical minerals that the US and the world needs? Because at the moment, China subsidises it very heavily. We know the US is not keen on the Inflation Reduction Act. How do you bridge that gap?
I'm interested when you're sort of talking about China being, I guess, ahead of the game when it comes to control over critical minerals, and we know how important they are for security, as we said at the beginning of the interview. Do you think the UK has been a bit asleep at the wheel here? Should we be more concerned over some Chinese influence that we've seen in some of our own infrastructure, with British Steel, for being an example?
Look, we've got quite stringent legislation in place. Everything from effects on universities through to critical national infrastructure. We went through the Huawei experience, and I think we're wiser as a result of that. I think the monitoring of that legislation and the articulation of objective security risks, whether it's from China or anyone else, is very important. In terms of critical minerals, look, the whole West, from the US through to Europe and other parts of the world, are 20 years behind China. And it's a race against time. There is a fundamental security risk, both national security in the way I described, military hardware, but also economic security. The green transition can't happen without those supply chains being put in place. And we want to make it, I think, the UK, and from what I see and hear from Keir Starmer, right the way through to Australia, Canada, the US, we want to make it a race to the top in terms of ESG standards, environmental standards, labour standards, not a race to the bottom. But we are all on catch-up.
We've been talking a lot about geopolitics, about Trump's attitude to China. We've, of course, seen the tariff war that we've seen as well between those countries. And today, the IMF have downgraded the UK's growth forecast quite significantly. Who's to blame for that? Is that what we've seen with the international trade war, actions elsewhere, or do you think we need to look a bit closer to home? Is it domestic related?
Well, I've only seen the newspaper reporting of it because it's come out quite recently. Look, there are clearly global trends. I think the tariff war, the export restrictions, the geopolitical fault lines, and particularly without the ability to see into the medium and long term, see how that settles down, clearly global factors. I think the IMF's chief economist also pointed to domestic factors, both fiscal and regulatory. We ought to look at ourselves in the mirror and see what we can do to mitigate our weaknesses and strengthen our comparative advantages.
One of the things is, we talked about the tariff war there. Some people say we should be fighting fire with fire when it comes to Donald Trump. Others say we should be throwing everything at a trade deal. What do you think?
Oh no, the smart thing to do, I think in general for the world economy, but also for a services-dominated economy like the UK, is to respond in a moderate way and actually liberalise and lean into this, because there is scope for picking up some of this trade that is otherwise going to stutter and is not going to go through the usual channels. I think a trade deal with the US would be very much in the UK's interest. But also I look around the world. We've talked about this Indo-Pacific tilt, and I think some of those economies in Southeast Asia are going to be open for business in a way that can advantage the UK. I think Vietnam is one of the most interesting countries for a long time. I went there twice as Foreign Secretary. Vietnam's gone back to the Trump administration and said, I tell you what, we'll cut all tariffs. How about that, if you really want to cut tariffs? I think for a services-dominated, high-tech country and economy like the UK, whose comparative advantages are in financial services, life sciences and tech, that's actually quite a good model.
I've got to ask you, finally, you obviously stood down at the last election. How's it been?
Look, I enjoyed what I was doing when I was in government. I'm loving what I'm doing now, both the critical minerals side. I'm doing some work on artisanal gold for the World Gold Council and see a bit more of my kids.
That's good. Anything in particular you've been doing with the kids?
Driving them around endlessly. I took the youngest to Thorpe Park with one of his pals, but, you know, usual.
You said you're enduring it, right?
Yeah,
driving around endlessly. I'm not
enjoying, enduring, who's to say?
Any karate?
No, I do get in the gym a bit more than I used to before, but I'm getting my back's playing up a bit for karate.
OK, OK. Thank you very much indeed.
Nice to
Good to see you. Well, let's chat again, shall we, to Saida and Phil. So we're talking about the economy, aren't we? We had that big IMF decision today. You'll get some people saying this is all the fault of the government, others saying it's all the fault of international factors. I guess the truth is somewhere in the middle.
The truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think the judgment of the IMF is that the truth was somewhere in the middle, although I think they weighted it rather more towards the domestic economy. But of course, there is both a real worry here for the government. Any threat to growth for a government which is predicated on growth is obviously incredibly important. But I think they know that the last budget didn't land well. I think they know there are things they did which have been difficult for growth. But obviously the other part of the message, which is to say President Trump, which is dominating the news, gives you politically something of a get-out clause. It gives you a bit of space in which you can manoeuvre domestically, because you don't have to take the full heat of the fact that growth's bad. You've got something to point to. So it's a sort of political windfall in a funny way, President Trump. But that's not to say they don't recognise there's some truth in the domestic part of that analysis.
Yeah, what's your take on this?
I mean, I agree with Phil, and, you know, governments of whatever colour have always used that. I mean, there was a period... Growth has stagnated in the UK for well over a decade now. And if you look at the way that we clung in the past to Brexit or COVID or whatever wind was coming and, you know, down the track to say, well, it's not, the Ukraine war. And each of these moments, just like the Trump tariffs, have some blame, but there is an underlying issue about how the UK economy is simply not growing. And what's interesting, I think, from Dominic's interview there is that, you know, when he says, you know, China is, 2 decades, 20 years ahead of everybody else, you know, so often, I would say, whilst we were waging wars over territory, and if you think about how many wars we've been involved in over the last 20, 30 years, and China quietly was waging its economic war, and it was going around the world, you know, taking up territory, buying up mines, buying up these spaces, doing deals with countries, and we were blindsided by that. And now, as we get to this critical juncture, there is a real problem about who has the resources that are necessary for future economies to grow. And, you know, I was Minister for Afghanistan for 2.5 years. And the number of times I would say, yes, this is all really important, but the exit strategy must absolutely include a plan to rebuild Afghanistan. And in that rebuilding of Afghanistan, which, by the way, has a huge amount of critical minerals, there was a future which would have been positive for Afghanistan and a future that we too could have benefited from, and we lost that opportunity too. So I do think some bad judgments have been made about our long-term vision for why these minerals were important and the way it was going to feed the future economy.
Yeah, the minerals thing is such an interesting question as well. I was interested by your comparison to the UK and China too. Why? I mean, look, this is the kind of $1 million question, but why do you think it is that we're so bad at getting growth?
Well, we've got a number of flaws in our economy. I mean, we've got a skills problem, which we've had for a very long time. It's very difficult to address. I remember years ago Tony Blair saying to me that he could probably invade France as long as we did so in the middle of a speech entitled The Skills Challenge, because trying to get people to focus on that is incredibly difficult. That's one of our problems. We've got a serious productivity problem, which really has eluded all governments, because I think the interesting thing here is we've got a problem with growth which has gone long back between governments of all complexions. It's not that any one party has suddenly got the monopoly on doing this badly. We've been doing it badly for a long time.
But when you say productivity, what does that actually mean? Is that people just not working hard enough? What is...
No, I don't think it's that. I think it's generally the mix of the economy, the nature of the economy we've got. We create quite a lot of jobs in this country, but they're jobs of a relatively low quality, which is to say they're quite low paid, which requires people to be on benefits. There's also not much chance of progression for people out of those jobs. So we've traded quite a high level of employment for quite a low quality of
So like high-skilled employment with the low-skilled...
Quite. We haven't replaced the manufacturing we lost from one generation with enough high-skilled I don't want to exaggerate, there is plenty, but there's not enough.
But even in the manufacturing space, I mean, my whole life I've been involved in manufacturing businesses. I still have a manufacturing business, and one of the reasons why we could operate was because we operated just in time. But then moments like Brexit meant we couldn't do that anymore, and therefore productivity is hit when you're having to tie up your capital in buying up resources up front, where you're having to buy at more expensive rates, where you're having to buy your raw materials in a completely different way, where actually sometimes your staff are not working because you haven't had the raw materials in to produce what you need to produce because you're let down because of all sorts of logistical issues. So this is when productivity starts to be hit, and this is why manufacturing becomes so incredibly difficult in this country.
Really interesting, really important points as well. Thanks both very much indeed. Well, of course, the outlook for the global economy is sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the columnist and leader writer for The Times, Sebastian Payne, and the journalist and broadcaster, Jenny Kleeman. You're watching The Politics Hub. Coming up, as the IMF piles gloom on gloom, we'll hear from the Minister, Catherine McKinnell, next on what portion of the blame lies with the government.
Mayhem in the Middle East, rippling in America's West.
Get back! Get back!
The resolve of these protesters is now being seriously tested. I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests.
None of this is a peaceful protest.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles. How are you feeling?
I am angry. It is an anti-woman agenda.
Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support, but it's nasty out there.
Anybody else?
Should the Defence Secretary and the Vice...
Wait, what country are you
from? The UK.
Okay, we don't give a crap about your opinion and your reporting. Why don't you go back to your country where you have a major migrant problem?
President Biden, do you trust President Xi? President Biden says that this meeting went well. He said real progress was made on a whole host of issues. Will your candidates win?
I hope so. I think they will. I think they're great candidates.
There's no doubt that Kamala Harris and her team are harnessing the power of social media. Do you think Kamala is brat?
Kamala's brat.
Were you scared?
Yeah, we were scared. It was terrible. Strong wind, building tearing down.
As them say, God works, so we can't do nothing.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. Sky News, get the full story first. Free wherever you get your news. Ghislaine Maxwell has pleaded not guilty to all 6 charges against her. Mum, how are you feeling today?
Jeffrey said, you answer to Ghislaine, you just don't cross her.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party.
I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi. Companies like these are helping India
in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration. Sky News, get the full story first.
Hello, welcome back. Well, before the break, we were hearing how the IMF had downgraded its forecast for growth in the UK economy. Earlier, I spoke to the Schools Minister, Catherine McKinnell, about the challenges facing the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. I did start, though, by asking her about her department's latest initiative to provide free breakfast clubs.
So it's a big day for parents, it's a big day for families, and it's a big day for children. We've got 750 breakfast clubs rolling out today, right across the city in a whole variety of settings. But it really is about helping hardworking parents make sure they can get to work and put money back in their pockets as well for the childcare. But really importantly, it's about giving children that really good start to the day. We know that breakfast clubs have really good evidenced improvements on attainment and outcomes for children, and just giving them that soft start to the day to give them the best start in life. And that's what we want for every child. And as a government, we're really committed to delivering on our manifesto pledge on that.
You're talking about the importance of giving children the best start in life. And I think many parents would obviously welcome the breakfast clubs, but also recognise that this is the time when there are real spending pressures on schools as well, whether it's special needs provision, whether it's teaching assistants being let go of, whether it is class sizes. What's going on at the minute in the background? Are you kind of having a bit of a fight with the Treasury, trying to protect as much money as possible for the education budget ahead of those departmental announcements we're expecting in June?
I mean, schools will always want to do the absolute best for their children, and they do an amazing job delivering brilliant education with the resources that they have. And so as a department, obviously, we're working really hard to support them to do that. And it's actually right that we find the best ways of getting the best outcomes for children.
The backdrop to all of this, of course, is the difficult economic circumstances. And today, the International Monetary Fund slashed its UK growth forecast by a third. And they made it very clear that the actions of this government, this Labour government, are partly responsible for that. Do you accept that?
So we know that the international situation economically is challenging, and we have the Chancellor today, hard at work as ever, making the case for the UK on the international stage, making sure that we build those international relationships to grow our trade and to support our economy. We've seen action the government's taken to support jobs in steel. We recognise there are huge challenges across the board. We've always been very clear and straight with the public about the challenges we see within the public finances, but we're also very committed to our public services and making sure that we take the approach that grows and invests in people and our economy, whilst also making sure that we take the responsible action to grow the economy in a really secure and stable way as well.
The question was about whether you accept that the International Monetary Fund made it clear that the government's partly responsible for the downgrade of growth. And I guess the reason that I asked that question is because it feels like this government's very good at pointing the finger at bad things other people have done, whether it is the international picture, whether it is the inheritance, and less good at taking responsibility for what it has done. And I just want to look specifically at what the IMF has said. So the chief economist told our correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, in terms of this downward revision, the domestic factors are probably the biggest ones when it comes to that downgrade. And the reasons that he gave was an increase in gilt yields, which spiked last year, arguably because of the increased borrowing, weaker private consumption, arguably because what the government was saying was a bad economic climate, and also the increase in taxes. These are specific things that have happened since Labour came to power. Do you accept some responsibility for the downgrading growth?
So since Labour came to power, we've created many jobs. The interest rates have been cut 3 times. We know that wages are going up after years of stagnation and very difficult, insecure and unstable economic circumstances in this country that we know have suppressed and depressed our economic growth. And I think what the Chancellor has done from day one has been very clear about the challenge that we face, but also how important it is that we build that stability and security within the economy. And yes, sometimes that means making decisions that are challenging and that people would rather didn't have to be made, but actually for the long-term stability and as part of our plan for change, where we are investing not just in economic growth, but in the stability and security right across society, whether that's putting more police on the street, whether it's investing in breakfast clubs, whether it's investing in green energy, whether it's supporting people to get into work and support with childcare as well, which is something we're very focused on.
So,
there are many ways
it's
that
a
we
no.
can
That's the short answer. It's
the
no
economy.
to taking responsibility.
Well, I mean, obviously, there are difficult decisions that need to be made for the long term of securing stability and growth, and clearly there are huge factors internationally and globally that are creating instability. But I think the Chancellor has been very focused on making sure that as a government, people know what we're doing, they know why, and they know that we're committed to the long-term growth and stability of this country.
Catherine McKinnell there speaking to me earlier. You're watching the Politics Hub coming up. Signs of splits on the Labour benches over the Supreme Court ruling that biological sex defines a woman. We'll have the latest. Hello, welcome back. Well, Keir Starmer has responded to the Supreme Court ruling on the definition of a woman for the first time since the announcement. He said he believes that a woman is an adult female, and he also believes the judgment will bring clarity.
I welcome the court's decision and ruling. I think it's very important that we've now got real clarity, which is going to be really helpful, I think, for everybody going forward, particularly those that have to deal with putting in place guidance. So I think that it's a good thing the Supreme Court have come to their decision. That does provide that clarity that I think will now enable us to ensure that all the guidance is in the right place, and to reaffirm something that I've long argued, which is about safe spaces for women. That's always been really important.
Well, Downing Street later confirmed the Prime Minister's view on the issue has changed, but there is growing disquiet among some in his party on both sides of the argument. Our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, joins us here in the studio. Tamara, what is the disquiet that's been picked up then?
Well, I think, first of all, Keir Starmer was asked this morning what a woman is, and he said it was an adult female, which to a lot of people will not sound like news, but the Labour leader and many of his cabinet have been on quite a tortuous journey over this issue, and he says that now the court has ruled on it, that brings clarity, and the rest of the public sector can take their cue from that judgment. Now, Bridget Phillipson, the Equalities Minister, has just been in Parliament taking questions on what this means in practice, and she said that the government would put an end to mixed-sex wards in the NHS, and she said act on behalf of women in prisons and sports, and also issue guidance to schools by the end of the year. There was a lot of concern raised by MPs, about a dozen Labour MPs I counted, who said that trans people have been left feeling fearful, not knowing what facilities they can use. One MP said if a trans constituent of theirs has used women's toilets for 50 years, should they now stop doing so? And essentially a lot of this is waiting on guidance and how it's going to be implemented. Kemi Badenoch really went for Keir Starmer. She said that he should apologise for some of the positions he's previously expressed and say why he's changed his view. Now, I spoke to one of the Labour MPs who's supportive of the Supreme Court ruling and asked about that issue, should Keir Starmer apologise? And she said that he shouldn't. This is what Tonia Antoniazzi said to me.
Ultimately, politicians just want to be kind, and they want to serve their constituents, and they want to do the best job for people to live their best lives. The problem that we've got is that lobby was so strong, so much money behind it, that people fell into that trap. And now we've got to unpick it, we've got to solve it, and we've got people, to look after.
So she says that politicians were sort of captured by campaign groups. There was a lot of discussion about campaign groups, and Bridget Phillipson criticised some of the protests we saw over the weekend. But clearly there's a lot of questions that are going to need to be answered over the next few weeks about how this works in practice. I think there could be a lot of dissent along the way.
Yeah, well, at this point, I want to bring in Saeed and Phil into this discussion, because as you say, many people wouldn't see it as news that a woman is an adult female, but it has been this very heated debate, discussion about this over many years. Saeeda, what's your sort of stance on the Supreme Court decisions? Helpful?
I think it is helpful, and I think it's important to remember that it's on a very narrow issue. This is a case that originated in Scotland, eventually was ruled in one direction, then was appealed, ruled in another direction, then eventually found itself at the Supreme Court. And the judgment that they were making was whether under the Equality Act, when you talk about discrimination and discrimination against women, how do you define women? And that's defined by biological sex. But that does not mean that we can discriminate against the trans community. And because the Equality Act also covers the trans community too have to be protected from discrimination, just not within this gender-specific definition of a woman. And so I think when the guidance comes to light, it's really important that we strike a balance between, of course, securing what are gender-specific spaces, but also making sure that there is appropriate service provision for trans people. What you cannot say, for example, to a trans woman is, well, you can't now use the ladies' toilets, you have to use the men's toilets. I think what we will end up having to do is issue guidance and have facilities for people who can use a specific facility which is either gender neutral or is specifically for the trans community. And so I think it's really important that we don't allow this debate to become one against the other, because I think the culture war element of it is what I find really distasteful, that everybody in this country has a right not to be discriminated against. Women shouldn't be discriminated in sport, women shouldn't be discriminated in what are gender-specific spaces, gender-specific, say, wards on the NHS, in hospitals. But trans people shouldn't be discriminated against either, and they too should have appropriate service provision for which they are comfortable.
I guess the issue is when the two rights butt up against each other, though, isn't it? Right? Because, you know, you have single-sex spaces, toilets, as you say, you know, wards, sports, and there is going to be that decision at some point, isn't there, about whether someone is eligible or not to, you know, compete in that or to enter that space. If it's a trans woman who views themselves as a woman, or if it is a biological woman as well, I guess that's where the difficulty comes.
It is, and it's also where the politics of it comes as well. I think, though, this ruling itself is on the narrow application. I think it will set a course for the argument, and I think we probably will see in sport, for example, the instance of people who are born as male competing in female sports is already being addressed by sports bodies. So I think it will set a course. And I don't think it will entirely settle the argument within the Labour Party, because there are people in the Labour Party on both sides of this argument. There's no doubt about that. So I wouldn't be at all surprised to find some disquiet of the ruling. But I think Keir Starmer himself likes nothing better than a legal ruling. And I think he was sort of relishing the very fact that the lawyers have decided this. How excellent. If only lawyers could decide everything.
Yeah, he didn't seem to enjoy the questions before the legal rule. He's got something to point at now.
He's got something to say because, I mean, of course, all he was doing as Prime Minister, which of course Prime Minister has to do, is say, yes, I agree with the law. He didn't say any more than that. The law is now clear, and I absolutely agree with it. And so that's given him a clear position, which for a long time the Labour Party didn't have a clear position on this question. But I think from the leadership now it does have.
Really interesting. Thanks very much for the debate. Thanks tomorrow as well. Still to come on the Politics Hub. David Cameron's former policy guru Steve Hilton is running to be Republican governor of California. Can he follow in the footsteps of Arnold Schwarzenegger? We'll discuss next.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
An enormous explosion that's just come down. I think it was a monster that's just landed in between us.
Hundreds and hundreds of people hoping to get north, ultimately to get to the United States.
It's a border where they're not welcome, yet they keep coming.
We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people, taking them out and putting them into trucks and taking them away.
They make about 50 kilos of fentanyl a week. It's incredibly dangerous and toxic stuff.
There's been an upsurge in deaths. The fighting between the gangs is getting more and more vicious.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades, which is over there. This is much more like a normal town.
It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change.
We've been crushed. Free from wherever you get your news. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. This is real, hardcore emergency medicine. The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world. Sky News, the full story first.
Well, hundreds of thousands of people have been using the beast for years to traverse Mexico, but it is really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
The Premier League Run-In is live exclusively on Peacock. Catch your breath. Sunday, a strike towards Premier League history is in sight, with Liverpool on the edge of a second Premier League title. Full of tension, full of jeopardy, full of goals. Spurs look to thwart their trophy hopes. Everything magnified. This is the Premier League Run-In, live exclusively on Peacock.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, Steve Hilton was the blue sky thinking policy guru responsible for David Cameron initiatives like Hug a Hoodie to modernise the Conservative Party. Well, now he's running to be the Republican governor of California. The last Republican to win the Golden State was, of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So it got us thinking, is Steve Hilton the new Arnie? And we thought we would test our guests on whether or not they can tell who said what, Steve Hilton or Arnie. So we're going to rattle through some quotes. This is the first one, Hilton or Arnie. I was born in Europe. I've travelled all over the world. I can tell you that there is no place, no country that is more compassionate, more generous, more accepting and more welcoming than the United States of America.
I think that might be Hilton, because I think he might have been born in Hungary.
Yeah, he was. But so was
Well,
Arnie.
I mean, it could be Arnie, of course,
Yeah.
but I'm going to get... so therefore, it's a straightforward guess. I think it's Steve Hilton.
You're wrong. Sorry, It was Arnie. I love the thinking.
Still, I gave you some information.
A lot of thinking. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
It's very
So
good.
I'm overthinking.
It was Arnie, that one. Right, here we go. Number 2. After Trump, it will be a different Republican Party. And for the American workers, families and communities, that is fantastic news.
Oh, that's definitely the new Steve Hilton.
Yes,
It is.
I agree.
Yeah.
And as you said, the new Steve Hilton, because the old one wouldn't have
Yeah,
said
listen,
it, right?
I knew Steve when he was sane and actually was a lovely, compassionate, kind, liberal, person who focused on great things like climate change and social action, and we'd set up some amazing projects together. But, people kind of go through a transition in politics sometimes.
Right, number 3. These Wall Street types, they're not exactly the kind of people you want your children turning into. They're really not very smart. They're certainly not thoughtful or kind. They're often poorly educated, mostly ignorant, and always self-interested and greedy. Don't hold back. Who was it?
Could be either.
It could be
either. I think they both think that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to guess that's Arnie.
I think that's probably Arnie,
It's Hilton.
Oh, wow.
Oh, but you're right. It could be either, to
either,
be honest.
yeah.
It's a tricky one, that one. Right, question 4. I welcome and seek your ideas, but do not bring me small ideas. Bring me big ideas to match our future.
You can guess that one.
You see, I've probably heard Steve say that in the past. Can you just stop bringing me silly ideas, bring me some big ideas, when he was a man with big ideas. But I think that's probably Arnie.
It is Arnie. Very good. And I'm going to jump to the last one because we haven't got much time left. And this is honestly, I just love this quote too much. I have a private plane, but I fly commercial when I go to environmental conferences.
I'll leave that to you.
I hope that's Steve Hilton.
Unfortunately, it's Arnie.
Oh,
you
dear.
didn't do well.
No, I'm sorry.
But thanks very much.
They're
This is
identical,
part
the two of them.
This is it. There's too hard to tell the
Yes.
difference between them, but clearly is the message there. Thanks both very much. Lovely to have you on Politics Hub. Well, that is it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee. We've got, of course, more news coming through about the Pope's funeral on Saturday. Sarah J. Mee coming up next. And then, of course, you've got The World with Yalday Keane at 9 p.m. But I'll see you tomorrow.